Today we are very happy to have a Shaoda Wang Shaoda, who's my colleague at the Harris side, on the judicial independence. That's such a important topic, and especially it's on the economic growth part of the judicial independence. This is even better. Shaoda, please.
Okay, thanks so much. So the topic of my talk is judicial independence, local protectionism, and economic integration evidence from China. And this is joint work with Ernest Liu from Princeton, Yilu from Tsinghua University, and Wenwei Peng from HKUST. I think Ernest and Wenwei are also in the audience. So basically, ever since Adam Smith, generations of economists have always argued that a just and functioning judicial system is fundamental to a prosperous market economy. And ideally, we want the judicial system to be sufficiently independent from other branches of the government so that the courts can remain unbiased in contract enforcement, property right protection, and conflict resolution. But in reality, especially in most developing economies and civil law countries, the level of judicial independence is oftentimes inadequate. The governments will try to capture the courts and twist judicial decisions to their favor. And the common scenario is that local governments will pressure local courts to systematically favor local firms over non-local firms in inter-regional commercial disputes. And this could be driven by incentives to protect the local tax base or to extract more personal rents. When non-local firms anticipate this kind of judicial local protectionism, they're going to change their economic decisions in the first place. Right? If I'm a non-local firm, other things being equal, I should be more willing to invest in or do business in a place where the local courts are more fair and less biased so that my legal rights can get protected. And this means that judicial local protectionism could potentially have profound implications by distorting the process of economic integration at the macro level. And this is not a particularly new idea, where there exists a very long-standing theoretical literature on the importance of judicial independence. And there also exists a rich cross-country evidence on the correlations between judicial independence and various political and economic indicators. But despite the long-standing theoretical literature and the rich cross-country evidence, if we zoom in to the macro level, there actually exists very little rigorous causal evidence on the political and economic consequences of judicial independence. And that motivates our paper. Okay, so in this paper, we try to study how judicial independence affects judicial local protectionism as reflected in interregional commercial lawsuits, and how that in turn translates into economic integration as measured by interregional business investment flows. And we studied these questions in the context of a high-stake judicial independence reform that has been going on in China over the past decade. So we're going to explain the reform in much greater detail, but the idea is very simple. And so basically, before this reform, for every level of local court in China, its finance and its personnel were both controlled by the corresponding level of local government. So if the local court wants to appoint a new judge or promote an existing judge to a higher rank or pay salaries and bonuses to the judges, all these decisions have to be approved by the corresponding local government. So in this environment, it's relatively easy for the local government to capture the local court. So what the reform does is that in order to resolve this or alleviate this judicial capture problem, the reform tries to systematically decouple the lower level governments from the lower level courts, so that they do this by consolidating the financial personnel controls over those lower level courts to a much higher level of government, to the provincial government. So that after the reform, for the lower level prefectural and county governments, they no longer hold much leverage over the prefectural and county courts, which makes the local courts much more independent than before. So in this paper, we try to understand the consequence of this reform, where both the consequence of decoupling lower level governments from lower level courts, but also the consequence of empowering the higher governments by consolidating all the power to them. And we evaluated these consequences by combining two novel administrative data sets in China. So the first data set is the universe of court judgment files in China, which contains information on the more than 130 million lawsuits, the verdicts for the more than 130 million lawsuits filed over the past decade. I will link that to the universe of business registration records in China, which contains information on firms, more than 75 million firms registered over the past 4 decades. And so combining these two data sets and exploiting the staggered route of the judicial reform over the past decade, in the paper we're going to document rich reduced form evidence on the judicial impacts and the economic impacts of the reform. And then in the end of the paper, we have a very simple mallet-style model of interregional investment decisions, which allows us to map the reduced form results to aggregate welfare implications. And specifically, in today's talk, I'm going to be mainly discussing 2 sets of results. So first, we're going to dig deep into the judicial impacts of the reform. I'm going to show you that when a local region undergoes the judicial independence reform, in interregional commercial lawsuits between non-local plaintiffs and local defendants, the local defendants' win rate will fall by 7%. So there's a significant reduction in judicial local protectionism. And this effect is particularly salient for those firms that are politically connected to the local governments. But you don't see similar effects for firms that are connected to higher levels, such as provincial or central governments. So this reform shields protectionism at the lower level, but fails to do so at the higher levels. And in the paper, we show that the results of reduced judicial local protectionism are mainly driven by intensive margin change in judges' incentives. So for very similar cases, the same judge before and after the reform will give very different rulings, and that's the main driving force of the result. And in contrast, on the extensive margin, when non-local firms observe this intensive margin change in judges' incentives, they're going to change their litigation patterns in response. And we see that this reform encouraged a lot of those smaller, less powerful non-local plaintiffs to challenge those large, more powerful local defendants. And that changes the composition of cases in China in the longer run. And importantly, in the paper, across a spectrum of different measures, we show that this reform actually systematically improved the quality of judicial decisions given by this courts. So it reduces the overall level of biases in China's judicial system. And then in the second part of the paper, we try to understand the economic consequences of these judicial changes. And we document that when a local region undergoes the judicial independence reform, that region is going to attract more inward investments from non-local business and individual investors. And this is driven by non-local investors trying to enter into the local market to serve the local consumers, rather than non-local investors trying to invest in existing local firms to form coalitions to lower transaction costs or to seek for more protection. And through the lens of our mallet-style model, we can calculate that when this reform rolls out to the entire country, by facilitating better economic integration, it has the potential to increase China's economic surplus by roughly 2% of GDP. Right, so that's the main idea of this paper. So in the remainder of the talk, I'll first explain to you the institutional background and the data construction, and then I'll talk about the judicial impacts of the reform, the economic impacts of the reform, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so institutional background. So China mainly has 4 layers of courts. Right? At the top, you have Supreme People's Court. And below that, you have provincial high courts, prefectural intermediate courts, and county basic courts. And by default, a commercial lawsuit will be tried in the defendant's jurisdiction. Right? So if a firm in Beijing sues a firm in Shanghai, then a local firm in Shanghai will be handling that case. And typically, the first hearing will happen at the county basic court level. But for a small share of very high-stake commercial lawsuits, the first hearing might already happen at the intermediate court level. And after the first hearing, each party has 1 chance to appeal the decision, and the appeal will be handled by the next tier of corresponding court. And the important feature in this setting is that China is a country that largely follows the civil law tradition. So in this system, you don't have jury, and you don't have any legally binding precedent. So virtually all the important decisions are made by the local judges, where the local judges are responsible for establishing key facts about the case. They're responsible for applying appropriate codes in law to the case. They're responsible for ruling, sentencing, so on and so forth. So virtually the quality of the judicial decisions hinges almost entirely on the incentives of these local judges. And to understand the incentives of those local judges, we can look at this figure, which shows you the power structure of China's judicial system prior to the judicial independence reform. So basically prior to 2014. So you can see before the reform, within the judicial system, every higher level court provides professional guidance to the lower level court. But that guidance is suggestive only. It's not a binding constraint. And in contrast, the real leverage over the local courts are held outside of the judicial system by the corresponding levels of local governments. So for each local court, your finance and your personnel were both controlled by the corresponding local government. So for example, if you're a county court, if you want to appoint a new judge or promote an existing judge to a higher rank or pay salaries and bonuses to the judges, all these decisions have to be approved by the corresponding county government leader. Right? So virtually for a local judge, your two strongest incentive, financial incentive and career incentive, they're both controlled by the corresponding county leader. Right? So in this setting, if the county leader tells the county judge to favor a local firm over a non-local firm, it will be very difficult for the county judge to deny such requests. And indeed, for a very long time, local protectionism was a big problem in China's judicial system. So as early as in the 1990s, the president of the Supreme People's Court himself already remarked that our law is being taken by local officials as a tool to protect parochial interests. And in 2014, which is right before the judicial reform, the Supreme People's Court conducted a national survey of local judges, asking them what's the biggest problem in our judicial system. And nearly 70% of the local judges reported that local protectionism is the biggest problem. Right, so seeing the severity of the problem, right, in 2014, the central government tried to launch a reform to alleviate judicial local protectionism. And their idea is very simple. Where you have judicial capture in the old system because the governments can control the financial personnel of the local courts. Right? So if we want to make the local courts more independent, we can try to remove these ties. They try to do so by consolidating the financial and personnel controls of all those local courts to the provincial level, so that after the reform at the prefectural and county levels, which are the levels where the vast majority of commercial lawsuits are tried, the local governments no longer have much leverage over the local courts, which makes the local courts a lot more independent than before. And there indeed exists rich qualitative evidence in the law literature that this is the case, right? The judicial independence and judicial fairness improved a lot following the decoupling of governments and courts. That being said, right, if you look at the structure of the reform, I think there are still two noticeable limitations of the reform. And so the first obvious limitation is that power got consolidated to the provincial level, but they didn't go all the way to the central level. Right? So after the reform, if you have an intra-provincial lawsuit, then from the provincial government's perspective, both plaintiff and defendant, they're local. So local versus local, I don't have incentives to systematically favor one over the other. So for these intra-provincial cases, you can largely remove protectionism. But imagine if you have an inter-provincial lawsuit, then even after the reform, from the provincial government's perspective, this is still non-local versus local. And to the extent that the provincial governments might have some incentives to protect a specific local firm, then there may be remaining levels of protectionism even after the reform. Right? So this difference between intro and inter-provincial lawsuits will be an important heterogeneity that we explore. And the second potential limitation is that this reform basically consolidated all the power to the provincial government rather than actually cutting the ties between all governments and all firms and all courts. So basically, while removing the leverage of local governments against local courts, you might risk the chance of over-empowering the provincial and central governments. So maybe the firms that are connected to the local governments, they lose their protection. But the firms that are connected to the provincial and central governments, they might gain even more protection after the reform. Right? So this difference between locally connected firms and provincially and centrally connected firms will be another important dimension of heterogeneity that we look at. Okay, so this map basically shows you the rollout schedule of the reform. As the reform started in 2014, and then it rolled out over the next 7-8 years to the entire country. So right now it covers more than 70% of the local courts, and within the next few years, it's going to cover the entire country. And if you look at the route pattern, every year the government tries to choose some place in the east, some place in the middle, some place in the west to expand the reform in a quite balanced path. And this process creates rich variation that we can exploit for our empirical exercise. Okay, so very quickly on the data that we use. So in the paper, we spend a lot of efforts explaining the construction of the data and different checks for data quality. But basically, here, let me just very briefly explain the three main data sets. And so the first main data set is the route schedule of the judicial reform, which is collected from the judicial reform yearbooks published by the Supreme People's Court. And we corroborated that using local fiscal records. And the main judicial data comes from the universe of court verdicts in China between 2014 and 2021, which covers more than 130 million verdicts for the lawsuits that were filed during this period. And we collected this data by scraping a website called China Judgment Online, which is an official website run by the Supreme People's Court, where they mandate the local courts to publicize their verdicts in real time. And among the 130 million lawsuits, there are 6 million commercial lawsuits. So that's the sample that we focus on in this paper. And for each commercial lawsuit, we can extract some important information about that case. We can also track the eventual enforcement of the verdict. And the second administrative data set that we use is the universe of business registration records in China over the past 4 decades, which covers information about more than 75 million firms ever registered since 1978. So we collected the data by scraping the website Tianyancha, which licensed official data from People's Bank of China. And for each firm in this data set, we can have some basic information about their location and their size and also their shareholding structure. Okay, so with the data, we can construct our key variables. I don't have time to explain that in great detail, but we have that in the paper. So if you're interested, you can take a look. And so let me now talk about the judicial and economic impacts of the reform. So our main judicial analysis uses a very conventional event study specification. So here we aggregate the data to court semi-year level. So for each local court in each 6 months period, we calculate the average win rate of local defendants against non-local plaintiffs. So that's the left-hand side variable. And then on the right-hand side, we have the conventional event study dummies, and we estimate those conditional on court fixed effect and semi-year fixed effect. And the standard errors are clustered at the court level, and we also follow the recent econometrics literature to incorporate heterogeneous stream effects in those event studies. So the main results are presented in this figure. So as you can see, prior to the reform, local defendants' win rates basically was quite stable over time. And once this region undergoes the judicial independence reform, you see a salient reduction in local defendants' win rates against non-local plaintiffs. Right? So the local judges started to rule less favorably toward the local defendants. And this effect is quite persistent several years after the adoption of the reform. And to quantify the magnitudes of this result, we can estimate the corresponding DID specification, which suggests that the reform reduced the local defendants' win rates by 7% compared to the baseline average win rate. And this effect is particularly large for intra-provincial lawsuit. In contrast, for inter-provincial lawsuit, the effect is reduced by half. Right? So this is consistent with the idea that the reform essentially eliminates intra-provincial protectionism, but it cannot fully shield protectionism for inter-provincial lawsuits. And another interesting dimension of heterogeneity is different types of political connection. So here we proxy for political connection based on government procurement contract. Right? So if the firm never got a procurement contract from the government, we think it's not connected. Right? If you have procurement contracts from the local governments, we think you're locally connected. If you have contracts with provincial or central governments, we think you're provincially or centrally connected. And for these 3 different groups of firms, we estimate the same baseline event study specification. And what we see is that for the non-connected firms and the locally connected firms, right, they both have lower win rates after the reform. And that reduction in win rates is consistently larger for the locally connected firms compared to the non-connected firms. And so that's consistent with the idea that the locally connected guys, they used to receive a lot of protection. So when you remove the protection, they get hurt more than their non-connected counterparts. But interestingly, if you look at the orange bars, which represent the provincially and centrally connected firms, we don't see a significant reduction in win rates following the reform for these guys. So this means two things. One is that the reform does not remove protection for those firms that are connected to very high-level governments. So you can shield protectionism at a low level, but you cannot do that at the much higher level. But the second takeaway from this is that while this reform empowers the provincial and central governments compared to before, it's not introducing new biases for the firms that are connected to these governments. So while the reform reduces protectionism at a low level, you don't introduce new protectionism at the higher levels. So the net effect of the reform is still quite positive. And in the paper, we try to decompose the baseline effect into intensive versus extensive margins. So the idea for intensive margin is that for similar cases, due to changing incentives, the local judges might give very different rulings. And the extensive margin idea is that when non-local firms observe this change in judges' incentives, they're going to change their litigation patterns. And we try to separately identify each margin. So for the intensive margin, what we do is that we focus on the subset of cases that were filed within 6 months before the judicial reform. And then we compare the rulings that were given shortly before and after the reform. So we're holding constant the composition of cases and see how the changing incentives affect rulings. And what we see in the data is that for those very similar cases, the same court or even the same judge is going to give very different rulings before and after the reform. And that effect is actually larger than the baseline effect, which means that the baseline results are essentially driven by this intensive margin change in judges' incentives. And in contrast, on the extensive margin, we see that when non-local firms observe these judicial changes of judges' incentives, they're going to be more likely to file lawsuits against the local firms. And specifically, the types of plaintiffs and defendants that get involved in these cases are going to change over time. We see that after the reform, on average, the non-local plaintiffs are going to become smaller in terms of their capital and employment, and younger in terms of firm age. And in contrast, the local defendants are going to become larger in terms of capital employment and older in terms of firm age. So this reform encouraged a lot of those smaller, less powerful non-local firms to challenge their larger, more powerful local counterparts. And to the extent that we think these kind of cases where you have small plaintiffs and large defendants tend to have higher win rates for local defendants, then adding a lot of such cases into the mix will create a downward bias for the baseline estimation. And that's consistent with the observation that the intensive margin effect is larger than the baseline effect. And it's because the baseline effect is dragged down by this extensive margin change in judges' incentives. In case compositions. Okay, and then we also try to understand how this reform affected the quality of judicial decisions, and we took from the law literature a series of different quality measures. So, for example, we found that after the reform, non-local plaintiffs became less likely to file appeals, which is mechanical, right? Because they're winning more, and when you win, you don't want to complain. But what's interesting is that for the local defendants, after the reform, despite losing more, they're not filing more appeals. And this is consistent with the idea that the quality of the judicial decisions became better. So the losing guys, they know that despite losing, there's nothing to complain about. So that's why you don't see a symmetric increase in their appeal rate. And similarly, in the second figure, what we see is that after the reform, the local court starts to treat the non-local plaintiffs more fairly by allowing them to conduct forensic evidence examinations. But at the same time, they're not treating the local defendants less fairly. So this reform is reducing the overall level of biases and distortions in the judicial system. And we also see that after the reform, the judicial reasoning section in the verdict will be longer, which means the decisions are more legally defensible. And we see that the judges become less likely to quote those discretionary quotes in law when making a decision, which means that the decisions become less arbitrary and more legally sound. And so those effects taken together quite consistently suggests that the reform systematically improved the quality of decisions, judicial decisions, and reduced the level of biases in the system. Okay, so in the remaining time, let me very quickly talk about the economic impacts of the reform. So we document that when a local region undergoes this judicial reform, it's going to attract more inward business investments from corporate and individual investors. And this effect is true for both the number of investments and also for the total value of investments. And we found that this effect is driven by non-local firms trying to enter into the local market and operate in its own industry, rather than non-local firms trying to merge with its upstream and downstream firms in the local area to form joint ventures to reduce transaction costs or to seek for more protection from the local government. So this is consistent with the closing idea that when you lower transaction costs, firms will be more willing to operate in the local market directly. And through the lens of our model, we can calculate that when this reform rolls out to the entire country, it has a potential to increase China's total economic surplus by about 2% of GDP. So to conclude, in this paper, we document that this judicial reform decoupling local governments from local courts could systematically reduce judicial local protectionism, where you see a significant reduction in the win rates of local defendants against non-local plaintiffs. And that's really driven by the changes in judges' incentives. And that also leads to a further change in case decompositions in the long run. I also see that the quality of judicial decisions improve a lot following the reform. And on the economic side, we see that this kind of reduction in judicial local protectionism can facilitate more inter-regional investment flows. And so it facilitates better economic integration. And by doing that, it has the potential to increase China's economic surplus by 2% of GDP. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shaoda. I see that I didn't even push you on the timing. Great. So the co-authors might, if you want, you can respond to a question right now in the Q&A session, if you're free so. And now we have our discussant is Emanuele from both my colleagues. Emanuele.
Perfect. Thanks, Jiguo, and thanks everyone for organizing this wonderful seminar. Thanks, Shaoda, for the fantastic presentation. You are going to make my job a lot easier. And my apologies if I'm a bit sick. I will have a bit less energy than usual, but hopefully I'll do a good job to a very good paper. So what's the paper in one slide? Again, Shaoda did a fantastic job at summarizing what the paper does. And the paper has a very logical and simple flow. So there is a judicial reform in China starting in 2014 that essentially takes control away from local governments over the local courts. Okay, so the local courts now are going to be potentially less pressured by the local governments to do what the local government wants. What is the quote unquote first stage of this shock? The first stage is kind of like now no local firms, in a world in which there is a lot of local protectionism, no local firms would be more likely to win disputes in court against local firms. Okay, what will this do then to economic outcomes, which is ultimately, I think, and I will argue what we should care the most about. We see that this is going to generate more entry into the local economy and more investment. And this is coming from the non-local firm. And how can we interpret these results? We can interpret these results as the judicial reform had a good impact on improving economic integration, and this raises GDP, okay? So it's a very simple paper on a very important topic. The road for a discussion will be to first try to summarize a bit more and give a general positive assessment about the paper. Then we'll focus on 3 points. So I see this as a very polished and very advanced paper. And so it's kind of a think of it as like I'm doing the referee job of giving 3 comments that I think the author could or could not implement on something that sort of like could help clarify some important issues. And I will spend some time on each of them, and then I will briefly recap. So what I like about this paper is that this is definitely hitting on some very big picture questions. So like the way I think of it is kind of like there are arguably 2 of the most important literature of past decades. If I had to pick potential future Nobel Prizes, it wouldn't be a wrong guess to pick these 2 literatures. So we are trying to look at 2 big literature and try to say something that combines them. which I think it's very, very important. So like the one literature that, of course, the paper is touching on is the very broad law and finance literature. I could pick many, many papers here. An example would be the papers on legal origins theory by the LLSV, right? The Laporta, Lopez de Silanes, Schleifer, and Wisny. And so there are many, many papers related to that agenda. There is a recent, so the most recent might be like a Journal of Economic Perspective 2008 paper, where the idea that they put forward is very simple. Like if there is no legal protection of outside investors that limits the extent to which they can be expropriated, then we're not going to have financial development because people will not invest. That's essentially what this paper, what sort of like Shaoda's paper is doing. And so like there is a lot of discussion here about the idea of in context in which there is civil law, we might be better off by moving to contexts that look more like common law. Because civil law, to me, it's a very interesting quote from the LLSB paper. It's kind of seen as like policy implementing what the state wants, versus common law is more about let's resolve the disputes in court, perhaps in a more fair way type of thing. Now, whether those statements are going to be backed by data, that's a different story, but the intuition is very simple. Then we have the large literature on trade, right? And I'm not the most qualified to speak to the literature, but you can think like there are several interesting reviews. Donaldson has an interesting review on the gains of market integration. The idea is that we kind of all know and we feel there are very, very big barriers to trade both between and within countries, which to me is even the most exciting part as an empiricist, and that there are large potential gains for market integration. But that estimating these gains is very, very hard because empirically you're going to have lots of problems. By default, this is going to be a diff in diff. So once you treat someone, and that's going to have a spillover on someone else. And of course, we can do something to account for this, and the paper does a very good job. But the point is, we know this matters, but we have limited empirical evidence, both on point 1 and point 2. And so what the paper has is a very clever and creative approach to provide a bridge between the two literature. And they are hitting on the topic that I think in the literature that are already very important are kind of crucial. If you look at the LLSV type of like focus body of work, judicial independence and regulation of entry are probably the two most sort of like insightful studies that tend to be cited all over the place. On the trade aspect, we all know the Melitz paper, we all know the Shane Clino type of work. The crux of those papers is the idea of like reallocation. And once sort of like perhaps a certain area might be opening up and so on and so forth, that's going to generate reallocation. And so the concept of reallocation is key to this paper. Those are the outcomes that they can credibly estimate on economic outcomes. And so this bridge to me, it's very important. It's a simple but important observation of the local capture of the judiciary system may keep the local economy from reaping the benefits of opening up. It's very, very intuitive, very simple, but we don't really have a paper saying that. And it's shocking that we don't. And so what are the ingredients in this paper? Because you guys, Shaoda was amazing at summarizing the paper, but there is a lot in the paper in a good way. There is lots of like interesting results. So like, let me try to like do a summary, which might be worse than what Shaoda did, but like, so the paper has great data. We're gonna see like, they have millions of firm to fair cases they use. They even have more data that they don't use. They are dropping, when you drop 120 plus million cases, it means you have very, very good data and it's a good problem to have. And so with this data, they can measure judicial deficiency. And so I'm not going to get into the details of it. There is more that can be done because the data is so great. But the paper sort of like uses this quite fully. And then there is the firm level data. Firm level data, that's going to be something we're going to talk about. I hope there will be better data as well in China, but to the extent that this data exists, they're using the best data they can to answer this question because we're going to see the universe of firms and that's going to cover all the entire China. And this is the data that we've seen used in a few other papers by many people in the audience. The empirical design is a staggered definitive, very straightforward. We'll see that the analysis will be, for the most part, at the county level and using these judicial rollouts where about half of the 300 plus prefectures or cities, whatever, were treated by the time they look at the data, more or less. The key here, which I'll get back to later, is that the variation is at the prefecture level, not at the county level. Right? And so that's something I'll go back to later. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shaoda, even as I go. And what the reform does, I think Shaoda did a good job. I'm gonna skip into it. I think it's a very fair representation to say that they removed sort of like independence away from the local courts towards the provinces. And then they have a simple model, which we'll get back to at the end as well. So this is the slide that they showed. As you can see, there is a lot of interesting variation. One can complain about the fact that you have lots of the prefectures that are treated in a given year are treated all together. And so that's going to make it a bit harder to estimate spillovers. But still, we have lots of variation. And I think lots of sort of like interesting results that will come out of this. I'm gonna show also like, this is like a slide that I just created randomly. I just took the administrative units in China and randomly put colored one as treated and the white one in control. This is not a real variation, but the idea is that I want you to see what we are looking at. So like the red is the province borders for them. And there might be mistake because I was late and there's some manual component of it. But the red are the provinces. And then the blue stuff are gonna be the boundaries of the prefectures. And inside the blue, we're gonna see the counties. And so what we will see for the most part, I think again, the economic effects are what we really care, in my opinion, about this paper. So when it comes to the economic effects, what we'll see is that, let's say we pick like one of these central region that is in a purple shade. We're gonna essentially compare the effects of the purple region to one of the white prefectures, but most of the effects of reallocation are gonna come within a prefecture. So a lot of what is happening is that within a given county, now we're gonna see that lots of like firms from outside the county, but in the same prefecture, are gonna come in and are gonna fight with the local firms, okay? So there's not gonna be, despite the agreement being at the prefecture level, a lot of what is happening is internal reallocation within the prefecture. We'll get back to this point later, but ideally we see like where the variation is coming from. So the paper has three main results. One is that the win rate is gonna go down by a fair amount for local defendants. And we saw that there are sort of, the summary is the win rate goes down the most for local firms against non-local firms in the same province. That's kind of what I said, but with the legal aspect. The local firm still lose against the outside province firms. That to me is an interesting part we'll also get back. And that the win rate goes down the most for the locally connected firms, a little bit for the locally unconnected firms, and doesn't really change for the centrally connected firms. That's consistent with the idea of we are not removing, so we are not sort of like eliminating discretion. It's just that there's going to be more discretion perhaps at the province level more so than the local courts. And there are a few other interesting things that Shaoda talked in detail about. The second result, which is very, very important, is that the quality of the judicial decision goes up. Again, we can argue for hours about how you measure this. I think the authors do a very, very good job at doing this. And so let's assume for today's sake that this is a fact. Judicial quality goes up. The third effect, which again is to me what the paper should all be about, and the paper will probably like make it the biggest dent in the literature because of this, is that we see real effects. So non-local investment in treating counties goes up by a fair amount, let's say again. Quantities we'll talk later about. And this effect is mostly coming from within the cities. From within the same prefecture, we see that like people start shuffling around the nearby counties. That's what essentially the effect is capturing. Now, the first question, as always, that I try to ask with an empirical paper is the narrative credible? And to me, in this case, the answer is a resounding yes. So like instead of trying to do my sort of like own reevaluation of where we stand and why we think it's credible, like I had a fun time reading like the Alwyn Young 2000 QJE paper on the issue of local protectionism. And it reminded me both of like how perhaps less crazy fixated we were on identification, but also how much better writers we were when we were writing papers in the QJE in the 2000. It's a beautifully written paper with very, very nice insights. And the idea, of course, is like, and this is how the conclusion starts, which is like thinking about the fiscal reform of China in the late 70s, right? Which led to the consolidation of power in the local government. It's sort of like, why are we talking about potentially detrimental effects of giving power to the local government when China went through such big growth over this time period, right? But the idea is that we can still have massive growth and create some distortions along the way. And so, with some data, he tries to make the argument that that's the case, but it's more about the stories that they talk about how sort of like up until 1979, we had an historical system of like full remission of enterprise surpluses, as we all know in this audience, to the government, which were replaced with the idea of contracts that specify the division of profits between the government and the firms, right? With incentive for the higher value-added firms, basically. The problem is that once you start to get into contracts between firms and government in China, it's going to be very hard to do it at the central level because there's going to be like lots of monitoring issues of all sorts, lots of like local deals that you want to strike. And so the idea is that this led to massive consolidation of power to the local authorities, which became very much entrenched. And they had lots of incentive to make sure that the firms that were generating the highest revenue, that they could tax the most, and they could sort of like show the central government the most benefit, would be very, very important for them. And you want to nurture them. You want to favor them against the competitors, which are not local. So that's why, of course, like these narratives are very important. That's what the paper is doing. And it's incredibly believable. And of course, it's obvious that the legal system plays a big role, right? What the legal system can do is anything. We're talking about contracts between firms and governments and between firms and other firms. So there's going to be disputes all the time about who's right in a given contract, who should be getting the favorable treatment versus not, is the favorable treatment fair or not, and so on and so forth. And so the paper gets to like essentially the essence of all this discussion about the trade-off between making it more efficient to give power to the local governments and have the economy develop, but also giving way perhaps too much discretion, which might generate distortion. And then you can argue, okay, but once we grew, why do we still keep these distortions? Well, the point of Alvin Yang was like very simple, which is at that point, once you have years and years of entrenched interest, it's going to be very, very hard to get rid of that. And perhaps the initial reasons for why you do it become more related to the political connections, to the corruption stories, so to whatever dark side of the allocation of money you can think of. But so that's kind of the narrative and what the paper is getting at. The paper is now saying, okay, so let's now take out one big weapon from the local governments, which is the local judiciary. And so if we take out this big weapon and they cannot sort of like engage in local protection anymore, what happens? And now that like China is perhaps a much more advanced economy, can we actually see benefits from this market integration? So I believe the narrative, and that's kind of like a big part of what why I think this paper is important. I am going to evaluate it in, so like my advisor back at Stanford, Nick Bloom, would tell me like, if you write an empirical paper, to get into a top 5, you need to have 2 out of 3 things. You either have a big question and great measurement, or big question identification or measurement identification. If you have all 3, good luck, almost no paper has it. I think this paper gets very close to it. The question is as big as it gets. We don't have empirical evidence. That's as simple as that. We have cross-country analysis for the most part. That's not satisfactory. This paper is getting at something which is very, very clever and important. And the implications are not just for law and finance and gains from trade literature. We speak to the literature on personal economics of the state, the importance of the judiciary, political connections, the role of decentralization and corruption, and of course, China's model of economic growth. Is it as good as it could have been, or could we have done better, and so on? The measurement is out of the world. The data is amazing. Like the only problem the authors will have is like which papers to write and how to allocate property rights on the data, on the co-authors. But it's really amazing data. And if anything, my complaint is that I actually don't know enough from the paper about what's in this data. Like what are these firm-to-firm disputes? I was telling Shaoda before the presentation. It's so rich that I think we can answer many, many questions of interest. Identification is not going to be bulletproof. I'm not going to try to convince you of that, but I'm also not going to complain too much about the paper. This is like a stagger rollout of the reform. And of course, these things are never going to be fully random. Sometimes they are, but for the most part, they might not be. But the authors do as good a job as you can do. We're going to see lots of tests. They're very transparent on the analysis. And like, I would also recommend you guys have a look at the paper by Shaoda and David Yang on policy experimentation. That will give you also like a little bit more background on how to think about where the government targets and why we might be concerned, but we might not always be necessarily super concerned about these issues. But I think what I like about this is that this relates to also my work on sort of like the rule of law and economic outcomes, the work by Jacopo Ponticelli on bankruptcy courts in Brazil, where you basically have a big country with lots of variation. In my case and Jacopo's case, it would be Brazil. Here it's China. And you can use the fact that you have lots of variation within the economy to look at how changing rule of laws affect economic outcomes. It's very rare to get. It's very rare to get if you don't have a big varied countries, and more work should go in that direction. And more work is going in that direction. So the paper, overall, I have a very positive assessment. My 3 comments are kind of like 3 comments, which is, one, it's kind of like a request for clarification for the most part. And kind of like, I tend to be overly concerned with precise measurements. So I'm gonna reiterate my desire for these things to be very, very precise. And I'm gonna have like, kind of like a couple of comments, which are perhaps for like just adding more narrative to the paper, trying to be more precise on how we think about mechanisms and so on and so forth. So one comment will be on what is exactly that we mean by firm location and by firm entry. To me, that's very, very important if we want to take the magnitude seriously. The second is going to be about the mechanism. Is it about local protectionism, or is it about corruption, or is it about just a better judiciary system? And that's, many of those things can explain the results. All of them are interesting. All of them are kind of part of the same narrative of of the paper, but perhaps the implications for policy will be a bit different. And finally, of course, the big elephant in the room, which is the reform good or bad? We see reallocation, but is reallocation enough to assume that this was good? I think we have enough to believe that it was good, but I'm going to push the author to ideally, perhaps if more data comes in or for new work, to get even a bit deeper on that front. So on location, the paper here is strongly grounded on the county of the firm as the measure of firm's location. Conceptually, this is going to imply that the local governments want to protect the firms in their counties. That's what we need to assume in a sense. Empirically, it implies that we can split firms into local versus non-local, and the local firms should be the ones that suffer after the reform, okay? But I think the perfect measurement is crucial here. And so it wasn't clear to me how we deal with these things, because these things are very tricky to deal with. And so for example, simple things like the trial is going to be heard in the defendant's jurisdiction by default, right? But if I think about the US and I think about I don't know, my work on bankruptcy, we know the firm's forum shop. And also in the US, you have something that says you need to file for bankruptcy in your own location. But location is a fuzzy concept. It can be where you have your headquarters, where you have the bulk of your economic activity. And firms play around these things to sort of get favorable treatment. So how do we deal with, what is the definition in China? I would love to have it super clear. The other is, we're going to have a lot of firms in China which are going to be multi-establishment firms. Many firms are going to have many big establishments in many, many places. Many SOEs will have millions of employees scattered around China. So how do we think about location of these guys? That seems to be quite important, at least to account for. Similarly, we're going to have many shareholders of many firms. Some are going to be in different counties. Some are going to be in the same county. How do we treat them? Are they local? Are they non-local? SOEs, as I mentioned, will span many, many, many sort of types of connections. Is the local what really matters? In the end, to me, what really matters is just what is the mechanism you have in mind. If it's local protectionism, it's about fostering something that is going to get into the pockets of the local government officials and the local government. And that should be what defines what the definition of local versus non-local is. But these are mostly clarification questions that the paper, I'm sure, is already dealing with. The other is, what is a new firm? So that's also something where if I want to take seriously the qualification, which I think is important, then we want to understand where these magnitudes are coming from. And so some form of confusion for me are the following. If a new firm is created, is this going to be counted as non-local? Most new firms in the US, in Brazil, that are the context I know about, in many other contexts, are typically spun out of the local population. It's going to be someone who goes out and creates a firm. Ernest quits as a fantastic assistant professor to create a sort of like a restaurant, and so on and so forth. So is this going to be considered non-local? My view should be that the answer should be no, but to me that's not clear, and I'll get back to that point later. Then let's assume that you only count as outside investment, a key measure in the paper, the new firms created by the individuals who were operating elsewhere. But then if we do this and we discount the new firm creation from scratch, how much of the action are we missing? And my speculative guess is that if we only focus on that, we are missing a lot of the action, because most new firm creation come from local individuals, which are not going to be in the data before the firm creation. So are these local or not local? The other issue, which is also just a source of confusion, nothing more than that, is that a firm will enter in year zero, a firm that is operating somewhere else. Now the firm is non-local, but now the firm entered. So is the firm going to become local or is still not local? Again, I'm getting to the concept of what is the economic meaning of local versus non-local. If I only care about getting revenue from that firm and it's going off to the central government because of that, then once the firm set up shop in my county, it becomes local. And so perhaps now these guys are doing better in courts because local firms keep doing better in courts. It's just that you count it as non-local, but actually these guys became local. So these things are very, very tricky to deal with, but I think clarity is very, very important. Now, on mechanisms. So there are reforms like this, and this is not a blow to the paper. That's every type of paper like this, including again, my work on corruption. These reforms are always a black box. It's going to be very, very hard to pin down exactly what's changing. But I do think it's important to try to get there, because if we pin down the mechanism, we're going to know where to fix policy and what are the generally applicable economic lessons. So the preferred interpretation of the author here is that there is an interconnectedness between judicial independence and local protectionism. Judicial independence, the difficulty is that we are never going to be able to measure it precisely. It's going to be kind of implied. And the local protectionism, I'm going to assume that it's not about corruption. I'm going to assume it's about, I protect my own firms because I get money out of it. And by getting money out of it, I'm gonna like go up in my career. I'm gonna make the central government happy and so on. To me, that's more of an idea of local protectionism. The rest would be corruption or quid pro quo. But so I do think there are two alternative interpretations that I think the authors are kind of talking about, but I think could be a bit more clarified. One is this idea of corruption. What's happening is not that I favor firms because I want to promote the local economy and so on and so forth. I favor firms because I favor my friends. I like to give favors to Tsinghua because Tsinghua is going to give me tenure and so on and so forth. That's kind of like the things that are happening at this level and could be justifying some of the results. The other is the judiciary is getting more efficient. A more efficient judiciary, I can come up with story for why that's going to affect more positively non-local firms versus local firms. So let me give an example of like some of the results that I think are all very interesting, but it's going to be consistent with many different stories. One is we see that the results are showing that politically connected firms perhaps are the ones that suffer the most if they're local, they benefit the most if they're central. Is this about local protection or is it about corruption? To me, I would say it's more about corruption than local protection. Now, why would firms in the same province now lose to firms from outside provinces? If it's about local protectionism, now the control of the courts is at the province level. Why do the province-based firms lose? Perhaps the incentives are different, that's fine. But the fact that they lose suggests that perhaps either the corruption is going down or the system is getting overall better. Also, you show that judicial quality goes up. But then I can think that like management practices in the courts are getting better. And so what's happening perhaps is that now non-local firms do better because mechanically it was harder for a good system, for a bad system to protect non-local firms. Because bad judges are not able to collect the right information. They're not able to monitor a complex case. They're going to generate lots of bureaucratic uncertainty. Then non-local firms are going to say, forget about it. I'm not going to go through all this paperwork to please a judge that is inefficient. I'm never going to get my license to operate, and so I'm not going to get in. It's not about local protection. It's about management practice in the local courts. So I think you can do lots of things. You can use lots of data, but mostly just like I would embrace the potential channel at play, and that's going to tell us what we can improve. If it's about corruption, then let's crack down on corruption. If it's about protectionism, let's change the incentive that we give local governments. If it's about the judges being bad, let's change the judges. So that's why it's important to pin down what the mechanism is. But all of these are interesting mechanisms, in my opinion. I know I have 1 minute left. I'll try to do it in 2, Gigo. But the sort of like final part
2 minutes.
Perfect.
Because
is the reform good?
Yeah, it's a pride.
Exactly. Is the reform good or bad? And so the truth is that I actually believe, and I'm very sympathetic to the story of probably the reform was good, but let me play devil's advocate for a moment. That's kind of like my job here. And let me try to say, well, the reform was not actually good. The reform just led to the relocation of preferential treatment away from locally connected firms to centrally connected ones, okay? Now, what I'm saying here is that to me, and I'm happy to be wrong, but play with me for a second. For me, what is key is that to say something about whether this is happening or not, we need to be more precise about whether we know who wins and who loses. And the point is that if I look at the judicial effect of the main part, the first part of the paper, we see that there are winners and losers. Local firms lose, non-local firms win. Then we move to the economic outcomes, and it looks like everybody wins. Non-local firms invest more, local firms stay more or less the same. So I'm trying to square I believe the judicial effects more, because of course it's a dispute between me and Shaoda. If I win, Shaoda loses, and vice versa. And if I lose in court, I should be worse off. So local firms should be worse off. And this means reallocation should play a role. And that is also, to me, not surprising, because that's what typically these market integration sort of like studies will look at. And so my worry is that is the level of analysis and the data structure enough to pin this down? And so like the authors have an interesting sort of like way to look at this through a simple model. I might argue that if the model shuts down what happens to the incumbent firms, the local firms, we're going to miss the reallocation channel. So like I can think of a simple variation of the Melitz model where you actually had a distortion at the firm level that's going to generate reallocation. My point is, it's going to be very hard to know without showing aggregate outcomes whether the reform was good or bad. Right now, what the paper is doing, which is super exciting, is that it's showing that there is higher dynamism. There is reallocation potentially because no local firms come in. I'm concluding in a second, Gio. But to get to this is good, I think we are kind of have to making an implicit assumption that reallocation is mechanically good because market integration is good. To me, it would be a lot easier if you tell me look, I run the analysis at the prefecture level. That's where the level of variation is. And total number of firms, total investment, total employment, and so on and so forth go up, and so on. If that is a simple analysis, it's going to mirror your county level effects if you aggregate things in a certain way. I don't know if the data is going to be good enough to do that. You don't see exit probably very well in the business registration data. You don't see employment very well. But the more we can add that with a new paper, the more we can speak to firm dynamics model of why judicial quality will affect relocation, how that affects productivity, and then the GDP effects will be a lot more exciting to me. But you're doing already a lot. So like overall, amazing paper. I think it's like a unique combination of like great question, great data, solid execution. I would sort of like be incredibly positive for such a paper. It should be highly influential, and I mean it. And if more data comes in, if you have time for more work, I would just clarify channels a bit more and perhaps try to push a bit more on other economic outcomes, because that's the most exciting part of the paper. Sorry, I was late. Blame Tsinghua.
All right, thank you. I would suggest that if anybody have questions, to collect the question first, and then give Shaoda a chance to respond. Okay, Michael, you need to unmute yourself first. Yeah, good. Thank you.
So, well, yeah, this is a great paper, and Emanuele also gave us a great discussion. I just want to follow up on what Emanuele concluded. Well, maybe there are two things. One is on the mechanism. I feel like few people in our circle actually studied this judicial reform. So it's great that you guys are on this thing, which is very important. And when I talk to people in the system, I do feel like there has been a lot of improvement. And the improvement is really about, a lot of judges in old days, they were just not competent enough, or they just didn't pay enough attention. And some of them are simply corrupt. So these are all the things that we see have been improving over time. But whether or not we can call it judicial independence, that's a different thing. I think, to me, it seems like more like a big efficiency game, or, the whole system just becomes more efficient, better monitored, better incentivized. So it's not entirely clear to me whether we can call it judicial independence. And the other thing is, aggregate welfare implications. So I'm glad that Emanuele mentioned this Alvin Young's paper. But think about it, it makes total sense. Local protectionism, local protection is everywhere in China, as in many most developing countries. But the thing is, after 2 decades after this paper was written, you see China experienced a big economic growth. So it seems like the economic growth was not, too much affected by this local protectionism. And as a matter of fact, you see local governments have been playing a big role in this growth and development process, indicating that some connections might be actually beneficial to the economy. So now it just adds to, the concerns Emanuele said at the end of his discussion. How should we think about this thing? It's good or bad? At least maybe, to me, the evidence suggests that there has been a reshuffling of connections or powers. All the connections simply losing out, or maybe replaced by new connections or whatever. But is this a good thing or bad thing? It's less clear. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bernie. And then after that, it just Shaoda can respond.
I want to thank Shaoda for a wonderful presentation, and the authors raised a great paper. And Emanuele, I'm really amazed by how enlightening and how penetrating your insights are. Thank you very much. That brought your comment brought me to a few things, and one of the key points is really about what does it mean that there are less local wins. My understanding of the Chinese court system is that they continue, the system continues to try to improve, but still, like all the judges are party members. And before they go to court, as I understand it, I don't know whether I'm right or not anymore, but in the past, there would be a discussion of the cases by the party before they go to the court. And then the judges very often will have to consider the party's position before they make a judgment. That's what I heard some years ago. I don't know whether it's true or not. And that brought me to the question about what is the judge's incentive. Emanuele raised a point about that maybe that, they are more biased to, because of all these incentives, they're more biased towards the provincial levels well-being instead of local levels well-being, including corruption or just improvement in productivity. So I wonder if we can shed more light on this by looking at the judges' incentive. And it's very hard with your 3 million cases to look at who the judges are, what the incentives. I wonder if you can look at the age, the career concern of the judges to shed light on how they judge the cases, to improve our understanding of what it means by the locals win less compared to before. Thank you.
Right, Shaoda, just 5 minutes, and maybe Ernest will jump in too.
Okay, so first I want to really thank Emanuele for a wonderful and very encouraging discussion. There's a lot to digest, a lot of great points. We're going to think about it very carefully. Let me very quickly respond to Michael and Bernard. So for Michael, I think, the first question, the point is well taken, right? Like whether we should call this judicial independence or, this is like an improvement in the sense of rule by law, it's like a partial judicial independence. We have been playing around with words, but I think the bottom line I want to say that, we're not trying to claim that this is a complete embrace of rule of law. In contrast, it's like a partial improvement in the sense of rule by law, where the central government is injecting some level of independence between the local governments and local courts to make local governments operate in a better way. But they're not trying to tie their own hands in the sense that, the central government can capture all the judicial system they want. But, at the local level, we see some marginal improvements in independence, but we have been thinking about how to use the better words to avoid potential confusion regarding that. And the second question about aggregate implications of this, and in the past we have a lot of protectionism, but we still see fast economic growth. Actually, we have been thinking a lot about this, and the way I think about this is actually related to your work on special deals, right? So the way I think about this is that in the beginning, right, if you think about the first 3 decades of China's economic reform and opening up, and I think a key priority is to restore and to strengthen the local incentives to promote local economic growth. So you need to give the local guys a lot of discretion, a lot of tools, so that they can play around with those things to really protect local firms to generate enough economic growth. So I think given that this was a priority at the time, giving them those tools is the first order thing. And the second order side effect is that that generates a lot of protectionism. But I think over time, like in the recent decade, the trade-off changes a little bit, right? Because you already restored all the incentive, right? The competition between local officials is already so fierce. Like you couldn't, if you keep giving them more tools, they couldn't be more competitive. So in that sense, gradually the protectionism thing became more first order compared to the competition thing. So in that sense, if we can foster more integration at this point, there may be a larger return than before. So I don't see this as contradicting each other. I feel like they have different priorities in different stages of the reform. And then to answer the Ernest's question on the judges, so there's a great point. We have spent a lot of time. So Wenwei and I spent a few years trying to collect the data about the judges, and we actually are thinking about another project related to the judges. Basically, how the judges are connected to lawyers through a revolving door. Many of them actually quit their job to become judges, and then they receive favorable treatment when they go to the court. So things like that. But what you suggest is totally sensible, and we really want to do that, but we couldn't because we actually don't have like very detailed information on each judge. So basically, we see their name appearing in the verdicts, and then we see the name of the lawyers appearing in verdicts. So if the judge later turns into a lawyer, we can observe that. But if the judge always stays in the judicial system, we just keep seeing his name, but we don't know, where he comes from, or where he graduated, or what his age. So it's a little bit hard to do that. But point is well taken, and also I think this relates to what Michael mentioned earlier, that maybe the judges have been getting better over time, and I think that's the case. There has been this judicial quota reform that basically trying to make the judges more professional by giving tenure to a subset of judges that are really well educated, and then all the older, less professional ones, they basically can no longer be judges. They can be clerks in the courts. And I think also after the reform, the process that you mentioned, that the party can interfere with a lot of the decision, and everyone has to be a party member. That thing stopped after the judicial quota reform, because they made the judges a lot more professional than before.
Yeah, if I may, I understand that there exists a lot of efforts to make the judges more professional. And if in your paper you can spend a little bit of space to describe the institutional arrangement, the career concerns, who they are, and all this improvement, that would be a very good that would be good qualitative information that help us to understand your paper. I'm inclined to believe in you. At the same time, I'm craving for what really are because like Michael said, the professionalization of the judges and how their career incentives changes is very important in interpreting and understanding the result.
Yeah, point taken.
Ernest, do you want to add a bit, or?
No, I don't have much to add. Shaoda gave great answers. I just want to thank our discussant on all the great points.
There's one question on this confounding reforms that I usually ask that kind of question just because I know that China has too much stuff going on. Are there any around that time, the stagger?
So there have been several major judicial reforms going on over the past decade, and we collected the raw schedule of those different reforms, and we can control for the route of the other reforms during this period. So they rolled out during the same period, but following different schedules.
But what kind of things? What kind of things? Just in general, we are.
So for example, one of the major things that we mentioned is giving the judges tenure, right? That's the judicial quota reform. That happened during the same period, but they tried in different places at different times, but following a different schedule. So that was another very major thing that happened at the same time.
By the way, if I may, along the same line, I mean, you have so many provinces. Is there any variations in the result when you consider the economic dynamic of the provinces? I mean, some are more backward, some are more advanced, some are more integrated, some are less integrated internally. So is there any way that you can tease out I think right now the key question is really how do we fully interpret and appreciate your results?
Yeah, so we tried something related to that. So we when we started the project, we thought this has to be about corruption. So this relates to Emanuele's comment. So we actually look at how many provinces, so based on the ranking of corruption, right, exposed corrupt officials and things like that. But we actually didn't find a very strong heterogeneity based on how corrupt this region is. So that led us to think, this is more like, protecting the local tax base rather than extracting more rents from the firms for corruption. But that's quite suggestive.
What about the education level of the province?
The level, even education.
Right.
Okay, we can try that. We haven't tried that.
All right, Bernie, I thought we usually end at 9:10, right? So this is great. Thanks to everybody for participating. A month from now, we will have another webinar. The paper will be presented by Cai Jing, maybe. It's indirect effects of access to finance, and joined with Zedol. And it's March 15. Okay, and hopefully you can join again. Thanks again, Shaoda and Emanuele. Emanuele, I owe you a Chinatown dinner.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
Thank you, everybody. If I may, it's not March. March 15 is the American time. the 16 E's,
Oh,
Beijing
see.
and Singapore and
Ah,
Hong Kong
I see.
time. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
All
right.
Okay,
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
guys.
Thank you.